The morning sun on Arithia was a kind of gold that painters spent entire careers trying to capture and never quite could. It poured through the gaps in the mountain ridge to the east and spilled across the valley in long, warm ribbons, touching everything it reached with a gentleness that felt almost deliberate, as though the planet itself understood how rare and precious a peaceful morning was in this corner of the galaxy. Captain Lena Vasquez stood on the porch of her small house with a ceramic mug of coffee warming both her hands, watching her two daughters tear across the front yard with the reckless, beautiful energy that only children at the start of a school day possess. Sophia was 10, all flying dark hair and purposeful strides, already the kind of child who moved through the world like she had somewhere important to be. Elena was 8, round of face and softer in her movements, prone to stopping mid-sprint to examine a beetle or a particularly interesting stone. This morning, though, even Elena was running. They were laughing about something Lena couldn't quite hear from the porch. Their backpacks bounced against their small shoulders as they sprinted through the tall Arithian grass that grew in wild gold-green waves along the colony's main path, and their laughter carried back to her on the warm breeze like music carried on water. Lena watched them with a particular, aching love of a parent who has learned, through hard experience, to pay attention to ordinary moments. "Be good!" she called out, the universal farewell of mothers across 10,000 years of human history. Sophia raised one hand without looking back, a gesture so casual and so utterly her that Lena laughed softly to herself. Elena, though, turned fully around mid-stride, nearly tripping over her own feet, and blew her mother a kiss with exaggerated drama before vanishing through the door of the colony's hovering school transport. The bus lifted on its cushion of compressed air and drifted silently down the path, and Lena stood on the porch long after it had disappeared around the curve of the hill. She took a long sip of coffee and looked out across the settlement she had called home for 3 years. Arithia 4 was not a glamorous posting. The colony occupied a broad green valley ringed on 3 sides by mountains that shifted from deep blue to slate gray depending on the light, and it had none of the grand infrastructure of the inner worlds, no gleaming towers, no elevated transit lines, no commercial districts humming with commerce and neon. What it had were modest buildings made of local stone and recycled composite, vegetable gardens growing in neat rows between them, children on footpaths, and a sky so clean and so wide that on clear nights you could lie on your back in the valley grass and feel genuinely small in the best possible way. The colony was home to just over 3,000 people, not soldiers or explorers or the ambitious young professionals who populated humanity's newer frontier worlds, but something rarer and, in Lena's view, more admirable, ordinary families who had chosen a quieter life, farmers who knew the land they worked, engineers who built things meant to last, teachers and doctors and craftspeople who wanted open sky and honest work, and a community small enough that you learned the names of your neighbors' children. They had come to the edge of human space not to conquer it, but to live in it gently. Arithia 4 sat close enough to the border of the Velshari Dominion that the Terran Space Command had placed a small military garrison there, a precaution more than a deterrent, a token presence to signal that this world was claimed and protected. Lena commanded that garrison. 40 soldiers, light infantry weapons, a single orbital defense turret that could stop a pirate raider but would not last 5 minutes against a real military engagement, and a communications array that could punch a signal to the nearest TSC relay station in just under 6 hours. It was not a posting that attracted ambitious officers. It was quiet. It was remote. And on most days, the greatest challenge it presented was maintaining morale among 40 young soldiers who had signed up for the stars and ended up spending their evening playing cards and watching the moons rise. Lena had taken the posting anyway, because her daughters needed stability more than she needed career advancement, and because, though she would not have said this to anyone except perhaps Dr. Akib over a glass of wine on a warm evening, she had fallen completely, irreversibly in love with this small, improbable world. Dr. Thomas Akib ran the colony's medical center with the quiet authority of a man who had seen every variety of human fragility and had made his peace with all of them. He was compact and unhurried in his movements, with dark hands that remained perfectly still even when the situation around them was not, and he had the gift, rarer than any medical degree, of making frightened people feel, simply by his presence, that things were going to be manageable. He had treated the full spectrum of colony life, broken bones from farm accidents, allergic reactions to Arithian pollen, a difficult childbirth that had kept him awake for 36 hours, and the wave of Arithian pollen fever that had swept through the settlement the previous spring, filling his clinic with feverish children for 2 solid weeks. He had not lost a single patient. Mira Okafor taught at the colony school, a woman of such commanding presence that she could silence 400 restless children with a single level look, and of such enormous heart that she kept a handwritten record of every student she had ever taught, their names, their particular enthusiasms, the difficulties they struggled with, the moments when something clicked behind their eyes and learning became wonder. She taught science and mathematics and literature and history, but what she actually taught, in the way that matters most, was a belief that the world was worth understanding. She brought to the work every morning a passion so unguarded and so genuine that it made the people around her feel slightly ashamed of their own cynicism. These were the people of Arithia, ordinary and kind and far from the noise of galactic politics, living their lives in the way that most people, across most of history, have simply wanted to live, in peace, with their families, doing work that meant something. But the galaxy, indifferent to the preferences of those living quietly in it, had not forgotten about them. Far above the planet's amberlit atmosphere, tucked into the deep geometric shadow of Arithia's second moon where no sensor network would find it, the Velshari warship Fang of Supremacy sat in cold and perfect silence. Its hull was the color of dried blood, its silhouette angular and aggressive in the way that Velshari design had always been, every curve filed away, every surface sharpened, because beauty was considered a weakness among a people who had built their civilization entirely around the concept of force. In the ship's command center, Warlord Fiskaren studied the holographic map of the valley below with 4 amber eyes narrowed to vertical slits. He was tall even by Velshari standards, his scale body encased in ceremonial armor that bore the engraved marks of 30 military campaigns, and he carried in his bearing the absolute, unself-conscious certainty of a being who had never, in his 2 centuries of life, been given a serious reason to question his own judgment. The morning sun on Arithia was a kind of gold that painters spent entire careers trying to capture and never quite could. It poured through the gaps in the mountain ridge to the east and spilled across the valley in long, warm ribbons, touching everything it reached with a gentleness that felt almost deliberate, as though the planet itself understood how rare and precious a peaceful morning was in this corner of the galaxy. Captain Lena Vasquez stood on the porch of her small house with a ceramic mug of coffee warming both her hands, watching her 2 daughters tear across the front yard with the reckless, beautiful energy that only children at the start of a school day possess. Sophia was 10, all flying dark hair and purposeful strides, already the kind of child who moved through the world like she had somewhere important to be. Elena was 8, round of face and softer in her movements, prone to stopping mid-sprint to examine a beetle or particularly interesting stone. This morning, though, even Elena was running. They were laughing about something Lena couldn't quite hear from the porch. Their backpacks bounced against their small shoulders as they sprinted through the tall Arithian grass that grew in wild gold-green waves along the colony's main path, and their laughter carried back to her on the warm breeze like music carried on water. Lena watched them with a particular, aching love of a parent who has learned, through hard experience, to pay attention to ordinary moments. "Be good!" she called out, the universal farewell of mothers across 10,000 years of human history. Sophia raised one hand without looking back, a gesture so casual and so utterly her that Lena laughed softly to herself. Elena, though, turned fully around mid-stride, nearly tripping over her own feet, and blew her mother a kiss with exaggerated drama before vanishing through the door of the colony's hovering school transport. The bus lifted on its cushion of compressed air and drifted silently down the path, and Lena stood on the porch long after it had disappeared around the curve of the hill. She took a long sip of coffee and looked out across the settlement she had called home for 3 years. Arithia 4 was not a glamorous posting. The colony occupied a broad green valley ringed on 3 sides by mountains that shifted from deep blue to slate gray depending on the light, and it had none of the grand infrastructure of the inner worlds, no gleaming towers, no elevated transit lines, no commercial districts humming with commerce and neon. What it had were modest buildings made of local stone and recycled composite, vegetable gardens growing in neat rows between them, children on footpaths, and a sky so clean and so wide that on clear nights you could lie on your back in the valley grass and feel genuinely small in the best possible way. The colony was home to just over 3,000 people, not soldiers or explorers or the ambitious young professionals who populated humanity's newer frontier worlds, but something rarer and, in Lena's view, more admirable, ordinary families who had chosen a quieter life, farmers who knew the land they worked, engineers who built things meant to last, teachers and doctors and craftspeople who wanted open sky and honest work, and a community small enough that you learned the names of your neighbor's children. They had come to the edge of human space not to conquer it, but to live in it gently. Arithia 4 sat close enough to the border of the Velshari Dominion that the Terran Space Command had placed a small military garrison there, a precaution more than a deterrent, a token presence to signal that this world was claimed and protected. Lena commanded that garrison. 40 soldiers, light infantry weapons, a single orbital defense turret that could stop a pirate raider but would not last 5 minutes against a real military engagement, and a communications array that could punch a signal to the nearest TSC relay station in just under 6 hours. It was not a posting that attracted ambitious officers. It was quiet. It was remote. And on most days, the greatest challenge it presented was maintaining morale among 40 young soldiers who had signed up for the stars and ended up spending their evening playing cards and watching the moons rise. Lena had taken the posting anyway, because her daughters needed stability more than she needed career advancement, and because, though she would not have said this to anyone except perhaps Dr. Akib over a glass of wine on a warm evening, she had fallen completely, irreversibly in love with this small, improbable world. Dr. Thomas Akib ran the colony's medical center with the quiet authority of a man who had seen every variety of human fragility and had made his peace with all of them. He was compact and unhurried in his movements, with dark hands that remained perfectly still even when the situation around them was not, and he had the gift, rarer than any medical degree, of making frightened people feel, simply by his presence, that things were going to be manageable. He had treated the full spectrum of colony life, broken bones from farm accidents, allergic reactions to Arithian pollen, a difficult childbirth that had kept him awake for 36 hours, and the wave of Arithian pollen fever that had swept through the settlement the previous spring, filling his clinic with feverish children for 2 solid weeks. He had not lost a single patient. Mira Okafor taught at the colony school, a woman of such commanding presence that she could silence 400 restless children with a single level look, and of such enormous heart that she kept a handwritten record of every student she had ever taught, their names, their particular enthusiasms, the difficulties they struggled with, the moments when something clicked behind their eyes and learning became wonder. She taught science and mathematics and literature and history, but what she actually taught, in the way that matters most, was a belief that the world was worth understanding. She brought to the work every morning a passion so unguarded and so genuine that it made the people around her feel slightly ashamed of their own cynicism. These were the people of Arithia 4. Ordinary and kind and far from the noise of galactic politics, living their lives in the way that most people, across most of history, have simply wanted to live, in peace, with their families, doing work that meant something. But the galaxy, indifferent to the preferences of those living quietly in it, had not forgotten about them. Far above the planet's amberlit atmosphere, tucked into the deep geometric shadow of Arithia's second moon where no sensor network would find it, the Velshari warship Fang of Supremacy sat in cold and perfect silence. Its hull was the color of dried blood, its silhouette angular and aggressive in the way that Velshari design had always been, every curve filed away, every surface sharpened, because beauty was considered a weakness among a people who had built their civilization entirely around the concept of force. In the ship's command center, Warlord Fiskaren studied the holographic map of the valley below with 4 amber eyes narrowed to vertical slits. He was tall even by Velshari standards, his scale, body encased in ceremonial armor that bore the engraved marks of 30 military campaigns, and he carried in his bearing the absolute, unself-conscious certainty of a being who had never, in his 2 centuries of life, been given a serious reason to question his own judgment. Fiskaren believed, with a kind of conviction that goes so deep it feels indistinguishable from instinct, that humans were contamination, a weak, emotional, biologically inferior species that had stumbled into faster-than-light travel through accident and imitation rather than through the long, grinding centuries of disciplined conquest that the Velshari believed was the only legitimate path to the stars. The Dominion had been a galactic power for 4,000 years. It had absorbed or destroyed every civilization that had stood in its way, and it had done so because it understood a truth that the rest of the galaxy kept trying to forget, that the universe rewarded the strong and consumed the sentimental. And now these pink, fragile creatures with their ridiculous attachment to comfort and family and feelings had established a colony within reach of Velshari space, and the High Council, cautious, political, always mindful of galactic opinion, had done nothing. Fiskaren had found the inaction intolerable. The High Council had given him what they called quiet authorization, a phrase that Fiskaren understood to mean, Do something painful enough to make the humans reconsider their expansion, but deniable enough that we can wash our claws of it if the galactic community objects. He had accepted the authorization without hesitation, and he had spent 3 weeks selecting his target. The school, he said to his second-in-command, a younger officer named Vela, who stood at his shoulder studying the same map. The word landed in the room with a particular kind of weight. Vela was silent for a moment before he spoke, and when he did, his voice was careful in the way of a subordinate who disagrees but has learned to disagree carefully. Warlord, the humans place their young above everything else. Striking at children may provoke a response that the Dominion is not currently positioned to. Fitzgerald turned his head slowly and regarded Vela with an expression so heavy with contempt that the younger officer actually took a small step backward. That, Fitzgerald said, with the quiet precision of a blade being drawn, is precisely the point. I do not want to damage their buildings. I do not want to kill their soldiers. I want to break them. And nothing breaks a species that runs on sentiment faster than proving to them, in terms they cannot misunderstand, that they cannot protect the things they love most. Vela said nothing. He looked at the holographic map of the school, the low stone building, the playground with its crude climbing structures, the garden the children tended themselves, and he said nothing, because there was nothing left to say that would change anything. He would remember that moment for the rest of his life. He would wonder, in the long years that followed, whether he could have done something different, and he would never arrive at a satisfying answer. The attack came on a Tuesday morning at 10:15, in the middle of Mira Okafor's science lesson about the native flowering plants of Arithia 4. She had a specimen on her desk, a cluster of what the colonists had informally named Starbloom, for the way its petals arranged themselves in perfect geometric symmetry, and she was explaining the mechanism of its seed dispersal to 32 children who ranged in their attention from rapt fascination to barely contained desire to be somewhere with more running involved. The first sign was not sound but pressure, a sudden heaviness in the air, the kind that precedes thunder, except there were no clouds. Then the windows shook. Then the lights went out. 3 Velshari dropships punched through the atmosphere at such velocity that they left burning furrows across the morning sky, trails of white-hot plasma that the colonists on the far side of the valley would describe later as looking like the planet being torn open from above. They were past the orbital defense turret before its targeting system had even registered their presence. A focus jamming signal, precise and overwhelming, killed every communication system in the colony simultaneously, the garrison's tactical network, the medical center's emergency line, the colony's civilian broadcast array, every personal communicator in every pocket and on every wrist. One moment the colony was connected to itself and to the wider world. The next moment it was alone. Lena Vasquez was in her garrison office reviewing supply manifests when the power died and the windows rattled in their frames. She had the sidearm from her desk drawer and was moving toward the door before the echo of the concussion had finished rolling through the valley. She burst outside to find the sky marked by those terrible burning trails and 3 dark shapes settling toward the ground in a triangle formation around the school, their hulls gleaming with a kind of military-grade heat shielding that didn't belong anywhere near civilian settlement. She screamed into her radio. Static. She ran. The distance from the garrison to the school was 400 meters. Lena covered it in a way she had never run before and would never run again, her legs driving against the ground with a desperation that came not from her training but from a place far deeper, the primal, cellular terror of a parent who understands that her children are in danger and that every second she is not there is a second she cannot afford to lose. She was still 200 meters away when the dropship doors opened. The Velshari soldiers moved with the mechanical efficiency of a unit that had rehearsed this exact sequence until it had stopped feeling like anything at all. They surrounded the school in under 30 seconds, establishing a perimeter so complete that not even the colony's fastest runner could have broken through it. But they carried no rifles in firing position. They carried canisters, smooth, cylindrical, unremarkable-looking objects that could have been mistaken at a distance for fire suppression equipment. They were not. The canisters burst open with a sound like pressure releasing, and a pale green mist rolled out across the ground and drifted through the school's ventilation gaps, through the cracks under doors, through the windows that Mira Okafor had opened that morning because the weather was beautiful and the children always worked better with fresh air. Inside the school, 412 children breathed in that mist before anyone understood what was happening. Mira Okafor saw it first. She watched the pale green cloud curl through the gap beneath her classroom door with the slow, deliberate patience of something alive, and something in the quality of its movement, too purposeful, too quiet, triggered an alarm in her that bypassed thought entirely. She was already screaming for the children to cover their mouths, already grabbing the smallest ones and pulling them toward the back emergency exit, before her conscious mind had fully processed what she was seeing. She pressed her own sleeve over her face and dragged a 6-year-old with one arm and a 7-year-old with the other, and she made it 8 steps toward the exit before her legs stopped obeying her. The toxin, she would learn later, had been engineered with a specific, deliberate cruelty of something designed not to kill efficiently but to target precisely. It had been calibrated to attack the still-developing nervous systems of young humans while leaving adults with symptoms severe enough to be incapacitating but not immediately fatal. It was not a weapon of war in any conventional sense. It was a message, written in the language of suffering, addressed to every parent of every species watching from the gallery of galactic civilization. Lena reached the school as the dropship engines changed pitch, the deep, rising howl of vessels preparing to lift. The Velshari soldiers were already withdrawing, moving back toward their ships with the same disciplined efficiency with which they had deployed, their mission complete in a time that Lena's garrison commander's brain would later measure at 3 minutes and 4 to 7 seconds. She tried to reach them. She was held back by her own soldiers, who had arrived second behind her and who understood, even through their own horror, that 4 garrison troops could not fight 3 dropships and that their captain running toward those ships would only mean 1 more person lost. The ships lifted, the jamming signal held, and Lena Vasquez turned and walked into the school. What she found would revisit her every night for years. Not in dreams. Her sleeping mind had apparently decided that mercy required it to spare her the replay, but in the sudden, unguarded moments of daylight that catch the mind between thoughts. The sight of children lying across the floors of classrooms in the positions they had fallen, their bodies twisted by the toxin's assault on their nervous systems, some seizing, some terrifyingly still. The sound that filled the building, a layered, unrelenting sound that no training prepares anyone for, hundreds of children crying and gasping and calling for their parents with the absolute, naked trust of the young who believe, even in catastrophe, that someone who loves them will come. She found Elena first. Her youngest was curled beneath her desk with her knees drawn to her chest and her eyes rolled back so that only the white showed, her small hands clenched into fists so tight that her knuckles had gone colorless. Alive, seizing. Elena. Lena held her and said her name over and over and felt, under her palm, the violent trembling of her daughter's small body fighting something it could not fight. "I'm here," she said. "Elena, I'm here. I've got you." She said it until the words stopped being words and became something else, a vibration, a presence, the only thing she had to offer. Then she looked up and saw Sophia. Sophia was near the window where the first canister had come through. She was lying on her back with her arms slightly extended and her eyes open, fixed on the ceiling with the absolute, terrifying stillness of something that has finished moving. Lena crossed the room. She knelt. She pressed 2 fingers to her daughter's neck and found the hollow where a pulse should have been, and in that hollow there was nothing. No flutter, no drum, no sign of the girl who had waved without looking back 30 minutes ago as she ran toward the school bus in the golden morning light. Sophia was 10 years old. She had wanted to be a botanist. She had a collection of pressed flowers she kept in a journal under her bed. Lena Vasquez held her daughter's face in both hands and did not make a sound. Dr. Thomas Akib arrived within 4 minutes of the ship's departure, and he did not pause at the door to take stock of the situation the way that less experienced people might have. He walked in and immediately began moving from child to child, assessing, administering antitoxins from the medical kit he had grabbed on reflex, calling orders to the garrison medics who arrived behind him, and performing a silent, internal triage that his 30-year career had made a reflex. He worked without stopping for 19 hours. The colony's emergency transmitter, jury-rigged by a garrison communications specialist who had bypassed the jamming signal by rerouting through the orbital defense turret secondary antenna array, punched a distress signal into the void sometime in the early afternoon. It carried the colony's medical emergency, its location, and the raw security footage from every camera mounted inside and outside the school. The signal traveled at faster-than-light speed across human space and arrived at Earth 17 hours later. When the sun rose the following morning over Arithia 4, 68 children were dead. More than 200 others had suffered neurological damage of varying severity, damage that would require years of treatment, that some of them would carry for the rest of their lives, that had already, in ways both measurable and not, changed who they were and who they would become. Lena sat on the floor of the school holding Sophia's body, which had been wrapped in a white sheet by Dr. Akib's hands. Elena lay on a stretcher beside her, alive but absent, her face twitching with involuntary spasms, her eyes open but not quite tracking. Mira Okafor sat against the far wall with blood on her hands, not her own, but a child's, and an expression of such utter blankness that the garrison soldiers who saw her were frightened in a way that combat had never frightened them. The drawings were still on the walls. The Starbloom specimen was still on the teacher's desk, its petals arranged in their perfect geometric symmetry, untouched by everything that had happened around it. Dr. Akib finally stopped working when there was no one left to save. He sat down heavily on the floor with his back against the wall, pressed his face into his hands, and felt, for the first time in 30 years of medicine, his hand shaking. He had not permitted himself that before. He permitted it now. He sat in the quiet of the ruined classroom and let his hands shake, because some things are too heavy to hold perfectly still. The distress signal from Arithia arrived at TSC High Command in Geneva at 3 o'clock in the morning, local time, and within 1 hour every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and every sitting senator had been pulled from their beds and brought by armored transport to the underground war room beneath the old city. They came in various states of preparation, some in uniform, some in civilian clothes, one still wearing the look of a person who had been halfway through a pleasant dream and had not yet fully accepted its interruption, and they sat in the curved amphitheater facing a screen 3 stories tall. No one introduced the footage. No one explained it. The light simply dimmed, and it played. They watched the 3 ships burn their trails across the morning sky. They watched the systematic, methodical deployment of a military operation against a school. They watched the green mist. They watched 412 children fall. They watched Lena Vasquez run. They watched Dr. Akib move among the small, still bodies with his medical kit. A senator from the Mars colonies made it 4 minutes before she had to stand and leave the room. Those who remained in their seats heard her in the corridor afterward, and no one said anything, and no one judged her, because every single person in that room, the admirals and the generals and the senators and the intelligence chief with their career-long practice of emotional detachment, was using whatever they had left to stay in their own seats. Fleet Admiral Cal Rennick sat in the front row. He did not move during the full recording. His face remained as still as carved stone, his posture unchanged, his expression giving nothing away. Only someone watching his hands would have seen the slight, continuous tremor that he controlled by pressing his palms flat against his knees. When the footage ended, the room was silent for a long time. It was Senator David Chen, chairman of the Defense Committee, who spoke first. His voice was level, but the color had gone out of his face. What do we know about who did this? General Priya Nair, head of intelligence, answered without looking at her notes. The bio-agent signature matches Velshari military chemistry precisely. No modification, no attempt to obscure origin. They wanted us to know. The dropships were traced to a cruiser-class vessel designated the Fang of Supremacy, which jumped out of the Arithia system within seconds of the ship's lifting. The vessel is commanded by Warlord Fiskaran, operating under what our current intelligence suggests is a High Council-authorized covert operation. Children, said another senator softly, not as a question. The word floated in the air of the chamber like something that had no business being there. Admiral Rennick stood. He turned to face the room, and when he spoke, his voice was quiet, not soft, but quiet in the way that a blade is quiet, carrying to every corner without effort. I am requesting authorization for a full military response, not a retaliatory strike, not a punitive border action. I am requesting authorization to systematically and completely dismantle the Velshari Dominion's capacity to project military force permanently. Senator Chen leaned forward. Admiral, the Velshari Dominion has been a major galactic power for 4,000 years. Their fleet is 3 times the size of ours. They control over 60 star systems, and their military doctrine has been refined by 4 millennia of continuous warfare. What you're describing. I am aware of the numbers, Senator. Then how far are you proposing we go? Rennick looked at him. They targeted our children. Senator, we will go as far as physics allows. The vote was unanimous. It was reached in 11 minutes. which may have been the fastest unanimous vote on a declaration of war in the history of any democratic body in human space. The security footage leaked within hours, not through any failure of operational security, but because the people who had seen it felt, with a certainty that transcended protocol, that every human being in the galaxy had the right to know what had been done to the children of Arithia 4. By the time the TSC issued its official statement, every inhabited world in human space had already seen it. The reaction was not what galactic observers expected. There were no riots, no mobs, no effigies burning in city squares, no screaming crowd calling for blood in the immediate, animal way that the observation histories of dozens of other species had taught galactic analysts to anticipate from a civilization in the grip of collective grief. Human worlds went quiet. It was a specific kind of quiet, not the stillness of shock, but the stillness of decision. The difference, to those paying attention, was unmistakable and deeply unsettling. On Earth, military recruitment offices that normally process a few dozen volunteers per week found themselves facing lines that stretched around city blocks before dawn on the morning after the footage aired. The people standing in those lines were not the young, restless, adventure-seeking men and women who typically fill armed forces in peacetime. They were teachers, engineers, farmers, doctors, mothers and fathers, and, in several cases, grandparents. People who had never held a weapon in their lives, who stood in those lines with a steadiness that the recruitment officers would describe, in their written accounts, as the most quietly frightening thing they had ever witnessed. And when they reached the front of the line, they said, with variations of the same phrasing, the same essential thing, "Tell me where to go." On the industrial colony worlds, factory managers did not wait for government contracts. They convened overnight meetings, assessed their production capacities, and began converting their lines from civilian goods to military components before the official orders had been drafted. When those orders arrived 3 days later, the first deliveries were already loaded and waiting on the launch platforms. The galactic community watched all of this with an attention that bordered on dread. The Three Elder, one of the ancient, translucent-skinned beings who served as the closest thing the galaxy had to institutional memory, sat in its chamber aboard the Galactic Council station and read every incoming report with an expression that its assistant, in 30 years of service, had never seen on its face before. The expression was pity. At Nexus Point, the vast, multi-species space station at the gravitational center of known space, the Galactic Council convened an emergency session 2 days after the footage broke. 43 species sent representatives. Ambassador Seal Marchetti represented humanity. She walked into the chamber carrying a data crystal and nothing else. She did not prepare remarks. She did not consult with advisors. She simply walked to the podium, inserted the crystal into the presentation interface, and played the footage. The chamber was not prepared for it. Diplomatic assemblies operate according to protocols that exist specifically to create emotional distance between the raw events of the world and the process of responding to them, and Marchetti had bypassed every single one of those protocols in a single deliberate act. Several ambassadors looked away. The Moani representative, a species whose reproductive biology gave them a deep, almost neurological horror of harm to the young, crumpled and had to be carried from the room. When the footage ended, Thiven, the Velshari ambassador, a bureaucrat of the kind that empires produce when they have been powerful for long enough to start confusing their preferences with the laws of nature, rose and addressed the council with the dismissive confidence of someone who has never seriously considered the possibility that he might be wrong. This was a border incident, he said. The human settlement on Arithia 4 was established in contested space in violation of the Dominion's territorial sovereignty, and its citizens were warned on multiple occasions to withdraw. The Dominion deeply regrets any collateral losses, but the moral responsibility for placing civilians, including children, in a recognized conflict zone rests entirely with the human government. The chamber was silent. Ambassador Marchetti looked at Thiven for a very long time, in a way that someone looks at something they want to be certain they have understood correctly. Then she said, very simply, "Those were children." "War has consequences," Thiven replied. Marchetti did not answer. She simply looked at him, and the expression on her face, which at least 6 alien ambassadors would later describe independently in their memoirs, was not rage. It was not grief. It was certainty. The absolute, undiluted certainty of someone who knows precisely what is going to happen next and has already made peace with all of it. It was the most frightening thing most of them had ever seen on a human face. Later, In a private corridor of the station, the Kree Elder intercepted Thyvan on his way to his delegation's quarters. The Elder was very old in the way that certain things in the universe are old, beyond measurement in any calendar that younger species use, and it moved with the patient deliberateness of something that has long since stopped hurrying, because it understands that time eventually comes to everything. "I would like a moment of your time," the Elder said, in the clicking, resonant language of the Kree that the universal translator rendered as something slightly too formal for casual conversation. Thyvan stopped. Protocol required it. Even the Velshari did not dismiss a Kree Elder. "We have watched humanity for 200 years, the Elder said. "They are a peculiar species, capable of remarkable kindness and extraordinary destruction, sometimes in the same hour, and the factor that determines which they will offer you is simpler than most civilizations expect." It paused. "They are young. They bond to their offspring with a ferocity that we have not observed in any other sentient species in 12,000 years of galactic record-keeping. It is not merely biology. It is something woven into their identity so deeply that it is indistinguishable from what some species might call the soul. And you have just pulled on that thread." Thyvan's expression held a particular contempt of someone who has always found wisdom speeches tiresome. "We are the Velshari Dominion," he said. "We are defeated species far more dangerous than humans." The Elder regarded him for a long moment. When it spoke again, its voice was quieter, and something in its tone suggested that it was choosing its words carefully, not for effect, but out of genuine, almost sad concern for being in front of it. "You have not faced a species like this before. No one has. I advise you, and I mean this without any diplomatic ambiguity, to surrender unconditionally and immediately, and to present yourselves to their mercy while they still have some left to give." Thyvan laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound, and walked away. The Elder watched him go. Then it turned to its assistant and said, quietly, in the tones of someone adding an entry to a record they have been keeping for a very long time, "Note this moment. The Velshari were warned." In a secure briefing room deep beneath the Swiss Alps, Admiral Rennick stood before a holographic map of Velshari space and laid out the operational framework that would become known in every history written about this period as Operation Nursery Rhyme. The name had been chosen deliberately, not as a provocation, but as a statement of purpose so clear that no one who heard it could mistake its meaning. "We will not be conducting a punitive raid," he told the assembled fleet commanders. "We will not be sending a message with a strike and then pulling back to see how they respond. What we are going to do is remove, systematically and permanently, the Velshari Dominion's capacity to wage offensive war against anyone ever again." He paused. "Every shipyard, every weapons depot, every military command infrastructure, every orbital defense platform, every research facility developing weapons technology, all of it, gone." A young captain raised her hand. "So, the Velshari fleet outnumbers ours 3-1, and a defensive doctrine." "Numbers matter in war," Rennick said, "but they are not the only thing that matters. The Velshari have spent 4,000 years perfecting a system of warfare built on overwhelming force and centralized command. They have never had to fight without those advantages because no one has ever taken them away simultaneously." He looked at the map. "We are going to take away their command first. Then their force will be nothing but expensive metal floating in the dark, unable to coordinate or respond." He turned back to the room. "One more thing, and I want this understood at every level of this operation, from fleet admiral to the most junior technician. We do not target civilians. We do not harm non-combatants. We do not damage civilian infrastructure. We do not touch their children." His voice didn't rise, but its quality changed, becoming something harder and more final. "We are going to conduct this operation with a precision that the entire galactic community will be able to examine afterward, and they will see the difference between what was done to us and what we chose to do. That difference is going to matter for a very long time. Do I make myself clear?" The officers nodded, and in their eyes, Rennick saw what he had seen in the eyes of every human being he had encountered since the footage broke. Not hatred, not bloodlust, but a cold, absolute, perfectly controlled determination. The fury of a species that has decided something. The Velshari Dominion had spent 4,000 years building the most sophisticated military infrastructure in the known galaxy. It took humanity 14 minutes to make it deaf. Operation Nursery Rhyme began at exactly midnight, Galactic Standard Time. Phase 1 was not carried out with weapons. It was carried out with code, specifically with the most sophisticated cyber warfare assault in recorded galactic history, authored by human programming teams working alongside artificial intelligence constructs that the TSC's research division had spent the previous decade developing and that no one outside that division had known existed. The attacks hit every Velshari communication relay, every navigation beacon, every sensor network, and every command uplink in a 200 light-year radius, simultaneously and with a precision that was almost surgical in its elegance. They did not destroy the systems. They entered them, slipping through security architecture that the Dominion's technicians had considered impregnable, rewriting the underlying code from inside, turning the Dominion's own communication network into an elaborate maze of false signals, echoed ghost readings, and dead channels that fed convincing but entirely fictional data to every receiver tuned to them. In 14 minutes, the Velshari Dominion went deaf and blind. Aboard the command station at Vethren, the military nerve center of the Dominion, a structure that had stood for 8 centuries and that had never, in that entire time, lost contact with its fleet, High Commander Faisal stared at banks of screens showing nothing but static and felt something he would not have been able to name before this moment, because he had never experienced it. The word for it, in every language the Dominion had ever conquered, was fear. "Get me communications with the home fleet," he ordered. "We cannot reach them, High Commander." His operations officer's voice had a crack in it. "Every channel is down. Every relay is dark. We are completely isolated." "That is impossible," Faisal said. The blank screens did not argue with him. They simply remained blank. Across Velshari space, the same scene played out on every warship, every military station, every outpost and installation, officers shouting into dead communication systems, trying to reach a headquarters that could not hear them, discovering in real time that the invincible machine they had spent their careers inside had, somehow, stopped working. The Velshari military had always operated through a rigid hierarchy of centralized command, every order flowing down from the top, every response flowing back up, every vessel and unit dependent on that flow the way a living organism is dependent on its nervous system. The humans had understood this perfectly, and had removed the nervous system, and the body of the Dominion's military was now 4,000 years of carefully maintained muscle with nothing to direct it. Phase 2 began 6 hours later, before the Velshari had finished comprehending Phase 1. TSC fleets jumped into Velshari space, not in a single massive wave, but in dozens of smaller formations, calculated to appear simultaneously at the jump points of every major Velshari system, coordinated through the human's own communication network, which was functioning perfectly. They did not engage the Velshari forces they encountered. They established blockades, every system sealed off from every other system, supply lines severed, reinforcement routes closed, trade corridors blocked. The Velshari fleet, individually powerful, was now scattered across 60 star systems with no way to communicate, no way to regroup, and no way to coordinate a response to a threat they could barely see. The speed and scale of the deployment stunned military analysts from a dozen species. In the 3 weeks since the attack on Arithia 4, humanity had somehow assembled and coordinated the largest offensive operation in its history. The analysts built models trying to understand how. Their models kept failing to account for a variable that did not appear in any standard military readiness index. The fact that every human world had contributed not because they were ordered to, but because they had decided to. Factory workers who had been producing agricultural equipment converted their lines to warship components without waiting for government contracts. Civilian transport captains volunteered their ships for supply runs. Retired officers returned to service without being recalled. The human economy pivoted to a war footing with a unity and a speed that no external threat or government mandate had produced, because it was not driven by either of those things. It was driven by shared grief and shared will and the particular, terrifying energy of a species that has made up its mind. Phase 3 was a scalpel that followed the blindfold. Rather than engaging the scattered Velshari fleet in the kind of head-to-head fleet battles that the Dominion's doctrine was designed for, human strike groups used the intelligence advantage of their sensors to conduct precision attacks on the infrastructure of war itself. Not the people, not the cities, not the world-scale systems that kept populations alive. The tools of force. Shipyards fell first, the vast orbital construction facilities where Velshari warships were assembled. Human forces targeted the structural frameworks with carefully calibrated strikes that collapsed the facilities without triggering reactor detonations, because detonating military reactors near inhabited worlds would have caused civilian casualties, and Admiral Rennick's orders on that point were absolute. Weapons depots followed, then command centers, then military academies, then the research stations where new weapons were being developed. Each strike was preceded by a broadcast on open galactic channels identifying the target and its military designation, and each strike was followed by another broadcast confirming that the target had been neutralized and that no civilian areas had been affected. The entire galactic community was watching, and humanity wanted the record to be clear. On the worlds below, Velshari civilians watched human warships pass overhead and waited for the bombs to fall on their homes and their schools and their family gathering places. The bombs never came. That baffled them in ways that pure destruction would not have. They had 4,000 years of history telling them how conquering powers behaved, and it did not look like this. The decisive engagement came at Kareth Prime, a forge world that served as a manufacturing heart of the Velshari military machine. Warlord Fiskaran had spent weeks using physical couriers to gather his scattered forces, a process of agonizing slowness in a war being fought at the speed of light, and had assembled nearly 200 warships in a defensive formation around Kareth Prime's orbital ring. He had chosen to make his stand here. If the Forge world fell, the Dominion's capacity to rebuild its military would fall with it, and Fiskaran understood this with the clarity of a commander who has run out of options. The human fleet that jumped into the Kareth system numbered 140 ships. Fiskaran, watching them materialize on what remained of his sensor array, felt the first stirring of something that his experience of war had never produced before: uncertainty. The battle lasted 6 hours. It was not a contest. The human fleet moved with a fluidity that the Velshari had no tactical framework to counter, each ship responding to the movement of every other ship in real time through the quantum-encrypted communications network that had remained functioning throughout the campaign, adapting and flowing around the Velshari formation with a collective intelligence that made the rigid geometry of the Dominion's defensive positioning look like walls being built against a tide. Velshari commanders tried to call orders across their vessels and found the signal delay, the absence of centralized coordination, and the relentless pressure of human electronic countermeasures making every command arrive too late to matter. One by one, the Velshari ships fell silent, some destroyed outright, more disabled with their crews intact, and an increasing number surrendering as their commanding officers made the calculation that continuing to fight meant dying for a result that would not change. The mathematics of the engagement had been clear within the first hour. The fang of supremacy was the last to fall. A precision strike took out its primary and secondary engines without detonating the reactor, a piece of coordinated piloting that the tactical logs would later confirm required 3 simultaneous hits within a targeting window of approximately 40 meters. The TSC pilot who made it was 26 years old, from the industrial colony of Kepler's Landing, and when interviewed afterward, she said she had simply been angry and that anger had improved her aim. When the TSC Marines boarded through the airlock, they found the bridge largely intact and Warlord Fiskaran standing in its center with his ceremonial sword drawn. The Marines were in full combat armor, armed with weapons that could have ended the conversation in approximately 2 seconds, and Fiskaran faced them with a specific expression of a being who expects to die and has decided to meet that expectation with at least the appearance of dignity. Sergeant Major Teresa J.O. was the first Marine through the door. She looked at Fiskaran. She looked at the sword. She lowered her own weapon. "Warlord Fiskaran," she said, "you are under arrest for crimes against sentient life, specifically for the deliberate murder of 68 children on Arithia 4, and for the deliberate maiming of 217 others." She paused. "You will be taken into custody. You will be transported to a secure facility. You will face a tribunal of the Galactic Council, and you will answer in full for what you ordered." Fiskaran stared at her. Something moved through his amber eyes that had not been there before, a displacement of contempt by something that might have been confusion, or might have been the beginning of understanding. "You are not going to execute me," he said. The statement came out sounding like a question that couldn't quite decide what it was. "No," Sergeant Major J.O. said. "We are not. Execution would be too clean. You do not deserve clean." They took him alive, exactly as Admiral Rennick had ordered from the first day of planning, because Rennick understood something that Fiskaran's entire civilization had never learned. that killing a defeated enemy makes him a martyr, but putting him in front of the galaxy to answer for what he did makes him something else entirely. Something that lasts longer. Something that teaches. The war lasted 11 weeks from the initial cyber warfare strike to the final surrender. 11 weeks to bring to its knees a civilization that had been the preeminent military power in the known galaxy for 4,000 years. The number would be cited, in the decades that followed, in every diplomatic academy and every spacefaring species educational system, as a definitive case study in the relationship between motivation and military outcome. The High Council of the Velshari Dominion attempted to negotiate in the war's final days. Their first offer was extraordinary, raw material reparations worth more than the entire annual economic output of all human space combined, territorial concessions that would have doubled humanity's sphere of influence, the unconditional surrender of Fiskaran and every officer who had participated in the planning of the Arithia attack, and a formal public apology to be broadcast on every communication channel the Dominion possessed. Admiral Rennick read the offer in his command center aboard the TSC flagship Resolute. He took approximately 90 seconds. Then he transmitted a single word: insufficient. The second offer was more generous by almost any measurable standard, adding the complete permanent dismantlement of the Dominion's offensive fleet and the establishment of a demilitarized zone along the entire human border. Rennick's response was the same. On the third attempt, the High Counselor of the Velshari Dominion, an ancient being named Fiza, who had governed through 3 major wars and who had believed, until this moment, that every problem between civilizations was ultimately negotiation, personally contacted Rennick and asked him directly what humanity wanted. Rennick's face filled the counselor's screen. His expression was not angry. It was something quieter and harder than anger. "I want you to understand something," he said. "You seem to believe that this is a negotiation. It is not. What is happening right now is a consequence of a choice your government made when it authorized a military strike against a school full of children. Consequences are not negotiable." Operation Nursery Rhyme entered its final phase. System by system, with methodical and unhurried precision, human forces moved through Velshari space and did what Rennick had promised. They removed every tool of military force, every warship, every orbital platform, every weapons factory, every military shipyard, every arsenal, every piece of infrastructure whose purpose was to project violence beyond the Velshari's own atmosphere. They took it all. They did not bomb cities. They did not poison water supplies. They did not target food production. They did not touch a single school. They did not harm a single Velshari child. They did not, in any of the 60 star systems they moved through, engage in the kind of civilian-directed violence that the Dominion had inflicted on Arithia 4. The Velshari warrior caste, the ruling class of their civilization, a group that had defined Velshari identity for so long that its values had become indistinguishable from the culture itself, watched their entire world be disassembled piece by piece. The suicide rate among the warrior caste spiked to levels that alarmed the human commanders overseeing the occupation, and Admiral Rennick, in a decision that surprised every one of his senior officers, ordered human medical teams to deploy to Velshari worlds to provide mental health crisis intervention. "We are not here to exterminate them," he told his staff, when the questioning glances grew too numerous to ignore. "We are here to ensure that they can never do what they did to our children again. There is a difference between those two things, and we will maintain that difference every single day of this operation, because if we don't, we become the thing that justified what they did to us, and we will not become that." The officers heard him. They obeyed, and the human medical teams went to Velshari worlds and offered help to the people whose civilization had murdered 68 human children, and some of those Velshari accepted it and some did not. But the offer was made and the record was kept, because humanity understood that the record was what would last. 3 months after the war's end, the Galactic Tribunal convened at Nexus Point. Fiskaran was brought before it in restraint, before judges from 12 species, before an audience of the entire known galaxy. The broadcast was carried on every communication network that could reach an inhabited world. Estimates of the viewing population ran to several trillion beings. Humanity had insisted, when the tribunal was proposed, that it not be a human court. They had insisted on a galactic one. They had insisted on judges from species that had no particular investment in the outcome. They had done this, the ambassador explained, because they believed in justice, Not justice as something performed for an audience, but justice as a process, applied as consistently and as fairly to their worst enemies as to anyone else. Because if justice only existed for the situations in which it was convenient, it was not justice at all. It was the most unambiguously admirable thing humanity had done in the entire conflict, and it was noticed. Fitzgerald stood in the center of the tribunal chamber in the posture of someone who has decided that dignity is the last thing available to him, and that he will hold on to it regardless. His scales had lost their luster during months of captivity. His 4 amber eyes moved around the chamber with a calculation that had not entirely abandoned the habit of looking for tactical advantages. He had been told he could speak, and he spoke. "I am a soldier," he said, and his voice was steady. "I carried out a military operation against an enemy settlement in territory the Dominion considers disputed. The fact that there were losses among the young is regrettable, but the nature of war has always included such costs, and I make no apology for doing what was necessary to defend the Dominion's interests." The chamber was quiet. The lead magistrate, a 3 jurist of considerable age, whose species' 12,000 years of civilizational development had produced a legal philosophy that could absorb almost any argument and weigh it without flinching, asked Fitzgerald directly, had the bioagent used in the attack been specifically calibrated to target young humans? Fitzgerald was silent for a moment that stretched past the point of comfort. "It was calibrated," he said, "for maximum psychological impact." The magistrate did not respond. The chamber did not respond. The silence that followed was of a particular quality, the silence of something being heard and understood and permanently recorded. The prosecution presented its evidence over 3 days. Scientific analysis establishing, beyond any methodological doubt, that the bioagent had been engineered specifically to attack immature human nervous systems while sparing adult ones. Communication intercept showing Fitzgerald's deliberate selection of the school as the primary target, documented in his own handwriting. Testimony from survivors. Medical reports from Dr. Akib, read into the record in full, detailing the injuries suffered by 217 children who had survived with damage to their brains, their nervous systems, their capacity to speak or move or learn. And then Captain Lena Vasquez took the stand. She wore her dress uniform, pressed and perfect, not a crease out of place. She sat in the witness position with her spine straight and her hands folded in front of her and her face revealing nothing, no anger, no tears, no visible emotion of any kind. And somehow the blankness was more powerful than any display could have been, because it communicated, to every being watching in the chamber and the trillions watching beyond it, the cost of producing that kind of control. She was asked to describe the events of the morning of the attack, and she did, in a voice that was completely steady and conversational in volume and almost terrifyingly precise in its detail. She described the morning light. She described her daughters running. She described the school bus. She described running toward the school. She described what she found when she got there. She described finding Elena. She described finding Sophia. She did not cry. Her voice did not change. She was asked if she had anything to add. She said yes. She reached into her uniform pocket and removed a single sheet of paper. She unfolded it carefully. She looked at Fitzgerald across the chamber, and then she began to read. Sophia Vasquez, age 10. She read each name clearly, at a deliberate pace, and after each name she stated the child's age, and she looked directly at Fitzgerald as she read, and she did not blink, and she did not waver, and she did not stop. The chamber was completely silent except for her voice. After some names there was a slight pause, the ones at Cosamore, the children she had known personally, the ones whose parents she saw every day in the colony, whose faces she had watched grow from infancy. During those pauses, the silence in the chamber deepened in a way that several observers would later describe as physical, a weight pressing on the chest, a pressure behind the eyes. Kenji Tanaka, age 7. Amora Johnson, age 9. Luis Reyes, age 6. It took 4 minutes to read 68 names. It was, by galactic broadcast record, the longest 4 minutes in the history of interstellar communication. When she finished, she folded the paper with steady hands and placed it back in her pocket, and she looked at Fitzgerald one final time. Then she stepped down from the stand without another word, without looking at anyone else in the chamber, and returned to her seat. Fitzgerald, who had faced death in 30 military campaigns without lowering his eyes, could not hold her gaze. The tribunal deliberated for less than 2 hours. Warlord Fiskaren was found guilty of crimes against sentient life, the highest charge in galactic law, encompassing the deliberate targeting of the defenseless, the engineering of suffering, and the weaponization of a parent's wife's terror. The charge applied not merely to the 68 who had died, but to the 217 who had survived with damage that would follow them for the rest of their lives, and every family who would carry the weight of that Tuesday morning in every waking and sleeping hour of their existence. The sentence was delivered in the even, unhurried tones of someone reading from a document that has been very carefully written. Fiskaren was condemned to permanent solitary confinement in a Kthri monastery prison, a facility designed not for punishment in any brutal sense, but for something the Kthri considered more exacting: absolute silence, absolute isolation, and an uninterrupted confrontation with one's own thoughts. For a Velshari of Fiskaran's age, the remaining span of his natural life was approximately 300 years. 300 years of silence. 4 minutes of terror. The chamber absorbed this for a moment. Then the Kthri magistrate did something unusual. She reached into the folder in front of her and produced a sheet of paper that was clearly not part of the official documentation. Lighter weight, slightly crumpled at one edge, the surface covered in the waxy, slightly unsteady lines of a child's drawing. She held it up. It showed 2 figures standing beneath a yellow sun, holding hands. One was a small human with brown hair, drawn in the simplified but unmistakably earnest style of a child who is trying very hard to get something exactly right. The other was a small Velshari with green scales, equally earnest, equally simplified, both of them smiling. This drawing, the magistrate said, was made by Lena Vasquez, age 8, during her neurological rehabilitation following the attack. It is entered into the permanent galactic record. She set it down. Several of the judges looked away, not because they could not bear to see it, but because they could not bear the weight of what it meant. Their child who had been poisoned by the Velshari, who had watched his sister die, who was learning to write her own name again with a hand that shook, had still found it within herself to imagine a world where a human child and a Velshari child could stand together in sunlight and smile. The drawing remained in the galactic record long after the transcript of the tribunal had been archived and filed away. Long after the war had become history, and history had become the settled background of ordinary life. A small, slightly crumpled piece of paper that a damaged 8-year-old girl had made with crayons, which said, more clearly than any legal judgment or diplomatic communique, what justice was actually for. 5 years passed. The colony on Arithia 4 was rebuilt, larger now, spread further across the valley, with better infrastructure, a medical center that Dr. Keeb had designed himself, and a defense grid so comprehensive that it could detect a hostile vessel emerging from fast and light transit 3-star systems away and have a response in the air before the ship had finished decelerating. The colonists had debated whether to build it. Some had argued that turning their quiet world into a fortress would mean letting Fiskaren win in the only way that mattered, by taking from them the thing that had made Arithia 4 worth living in. Others had argued that choosing to stay while refusing to be protected was not courage but negligence. In the end, they had built the grid, and then they had planted flowers along its perimeter, and then they had decided that both things could be true simultaneously. In the center of the settlement, where the old school had stood, there was a memorial. 68 stone pillars stood in a wide circle, each one carved with a child's name and the years of their life, the numbers so small that reading them required looking closely, and looking closely was a point. In the center of the circle was a garden filled with native Arithian flowers that bloomed in colors the colonists had never bothered to name because the naming seemed insufficient: red, gold, and deep violet, and a particular blue that appeared only in the early morning and shifted to green by noon. The flowers were always blooming because someone was always tending them. That had not been organized or assigned. It had simply happened, the way things happen in communities when everyone silently agrees that something matters. New children played in the garden shadow. Their laughter moved through the memorial like sunlight through leaves, and no one told them to be quiet, because the memorial had not been built to produce silence. It had been built so that life could continue in the presence of memory, because the alternative was letting the memory become the only thing. Mira Okafor taught in the new school, which was 3 times the size of the old one, with walls reinforced with specifications that would have been considered excessive anywhere else in human space. She had not missed a single day of teaching in 5 years. Her hair was grayer than it had been, and her face had lines that had arrived in the months after the attack and stayed. But her voice still had the power to command a room without rising, and she still knew the name of every child she taught, and she still kept a handwritten record, updated now to include, in a section at the back, the 68 names she carried with her everywhere. She had thought, in the months after the attack, that she might not be able to go back into a classroom, that the sight of children at desks, of windows, of flowers on a teacher's desk would be too much. But she had discovered something about grief that surprised her, that the only way through it was through it, and that the children in her new classroom, alive, present, growing, asking questions she did not always know how to answer, were not a reminder of what had been lost but a reason for everything that came after. On the far side of the galaxy, the world of Velarath was undergoing a transformation that the Velshari themselves could not entirely name, because the language they had developed over 4,000 years of warrior civilization did not contain adequate words for what was happening to them. The fortresses that had dominated the capital's skyline stood empty. The military academies had closed. The warrior caste, the social stratum that had been the apex of Velshari civilization since before humans had learned to write, had lost its purpose, and in losing its purpose had lost its identity, and in losing its identity had begun the long, painful, non-linear process of becoming something else, without any clear map of what that something else might be. The first 2 years after the war were the hardest. Political chaos, cultural despair, a collective grief at the species level that social scientists struggled to categorize because nothing in galactic history had produced exactly this, a civilization that had defined itself entirely through military dominance suddenly confronted with a permanent removal of that dominance. There were those who could not survive the confrontation. The crisis intervention that human medical teams provided during those years, working quietly, without announcement, treating the people of the civilization that had murdered their children, was a fact that a galaxy would remember long after the details of the war itself had blurred. But something else was happening too, in quieter rooms and less watched spaces. Young Velshari, the generation born during or just after the war, who had grown up in a world where the old certainties had been removed and replaced with an uncomfortable but possibly generative uncertainty, were beginning to fill the vacuum with things that the warrior caste had considered shameful: art, science, philosophy, medicine, the careful study of other civilizations not to find their weaknesses but to understand them. A university that had trained military strategists for 300 years reopened as an institute of scientific research, and its first graduating class produced more original research papers than the entire Dominion had published in the previous century. A group of Velshari artists created a mural on the wall of the abandoned High Council chamber, depicting the attack on Arithia full from the perspective of the children. It became a place of pilgrimage. It was not a farce healing. It was not a complete one. There were still Velshari who harbored resentment, who yearned for the old ways, who taught their children that the humiliation they were living through was temporary and reversible. But the direction of change was clear, and with each year the new Velshari outnumbered the old, and the mural in the High Council chamber was visited by more people, and the university produced more graduates, and the language of the civilization was, slowly and with great difficulty, acquiring new words. Dr. Thomas Akib had moved to Velarath 2 years after the war to run a medical exchange program, one of several human Velshari Corporation initiatives established as part of the reconstruction framework that humanity had insisted on, because Rennick had been very clear that disarmament without development was not a solution but a delay. He lived in a small apartment in the capital city and spent his days in a clinic serving a district of 40,000 Velshari. He treated every patient with the same attention and care that he had given to the children of Arithia 4. A sick child, he had told the human official who asked whether he was comfortable with the assignment, is a sick child. The scales don't change a medicine. Some of his Velshari patients were uncomfortable at first, uncertain how to behave toward a member of the species that had dismantled the military and restructured their civilization. But Dr. Akib had a quality that his patients, regardless of species, eventually recognized and eventually trusted. He wanted nothing from them except to help them. No acknowledgement, no gratitude, no particular response. He simply offered his skill and his attention and his perfectly steady hands to whoever needed them, and slowly, one patient at a time, the uncertainty dissolved. The galaxy reorganized itself in the years following the war around a truth that no one stated officially but that was understood by every diplomatic corps, every military command, and every intelligence service in every spacefaring civilization that had watched what happened to the Velshari Dominion. Humanity was not the strongest species. The Krell had greater raw physical power. Humanity was not the most technologically advanced. The three possessed technology that human scientists could spend lifetimes studying without fully comprehending. Humanity was not the oldest civilization, or the most numerous, or the most diplomatically sophisticated. By almost every standard metric used to evaluate a species' position in the galactic hierarchy, humanity ranked somewhere in the middle. But humanity was, without any serious argument or qualification, the most dangerous. Not because they were violent by nature. They were, in fact, one of the more cooperative and generous species in the galaxy, quick to trade, quick to form relationships, genuinely interested in learning from civilizations older and more experienced than their own. They had an instinctive hospitality that most galactic observers found charming and occasionally baffling. They had a tendency to adopt the children of other species, metaphorically and sometimes literally, that was unique in the known galaxy. They were dangerous because their capacity for violence had a key, a specific, identifiable trigger that transformed them from the cooperative neighbors that everyone preferred to have into something else entirely. Something that would not stop until the source of that trigger had ceased to exist as a threat. And that trigger was their children. An informal doctrine began circulating among the diplomatic corps of every spacefaring species, passed from ambassador to ambassador in quiet conversations and classified briefings. It was known, informally but universally, as the Arithia Principle. The Arithia Principle stated, in its most distilled form, that no species, under any circumstances, for any reason, should harm human children. It was not written into any treaty or codified in any law, because it did not need to be. The ruins of the Velshari military machine were all the documentation any policymaker required. The three elder gave a rare public address to the Galactic Council on the 5th anniversary of the attack, in a speech that would be quoted for centuries. The elder stood before the assembly of 43 species with the unhurried composure of something that has outlasted the concerns of several previous civilizations, and it spoke for 12 minutes. And every word was attended to a particular silence that falls when beings recognize they are hearing something that will matter for a long time. Most species love their young as biology requires them to, the elder said. It is a function of survival, consistent across almost every form of life we have documented in 12,000 years of galactic observation. But humanity loves its children out of something different. Something that borders, in our best analysis, on the sacred. A devotion so deep and so encompassing that it transcends a biological imperative entirely and becomes something more like architecture, the foundational structure of what they are. The chamber was quiet. They will absorb insults and injuries and setback with a patience that other species find remarkable. They will forgive wrongs done to themselves that most civilizations would consider ground for war. They will negotiate and compromise and seek accommodation even in circumstances of significant disadvantage. They are, on balance, among the most cooperative peoples we have documented. The elder paused, but their children are the one line that does not bend. Once that line is crossed, the transformation is total and it is not reversible through apology or reparation or the passage of time. The Velshari crossed that line. They learned, at a cost that nearly ended their civilization, what crossing it means. Another pause. Let them serve, for all time that follows, not as a species to be mocked or pitied, but as the answer to a question that youngest civilizations keep needing to ask. The question is, how do you want to be remembered? The Velshari chose their answer, and the galaxy recorded it. The chamber was silent for a long time after the elder finished. It was a kind of silence that is itself a response. Admiral Cal Rennick retired 6 months after the war's end. He declined every political appointment that was offered to him. He did not go back to Earth. He did not write a memoir. He went to Arithia found a small house near the memorial, and began tending the garden at the center of the 68 pillars. He came every morning, and he stayed until the light changed, and he planted things and watered things and pulled weeds with methodical attention that his former staff would not have recognized as the same quality of attention he had brought to fleet deployments, though it was. In the afternoons, he sat on a bench near the center of the circle and read. When the colony's children came past on their way home from school, he waved to them, and they waved back, and some of them stopped to talk and some of them didn't, and either was fine. He had learned, in the months after the war, all 68 names. Not just their names, but their stories, what they had loved, what they had hoped for, who they had been before a warlord had decided that their deaths would serve his purpose. He carried those stories with him not as weights, though they were heavy, but as something more like responsibilities. a way of insisting that the 68 were not data points in a history of conflict, but people who had existed and who deserved to be remembered as such. He never spoke publicly about the war. The war was not the part he had decided to be responsible for. The garden was. The names were. The children who still played in the shadow of the memorial and who did not know, for the most part, why the old man in the garden always seemed to know their names. On a warm Tuesday afternoon, 5 years and 1 month after the attack, Lena Vasquez sat in Mera Okafor's classroom with a history project open on the data pad in front of her. She was 13 now, tall for her age, with her mother's dark eyes and a slight, persistent tremor in her left hand that was the last remaining physical trace of the nerve toxin's damage. She had learned to write around it. She had learned, with a particular resilience of children who have no choice, to treat the tremor as simply one of her characteristics rather than as a wound, though it was both, and some mornings it was more the latter than the former. Sitting beside her was Corvin. Corvin was the first participant in the colony's new interspecies exchange program, a young Velshari, approximately Lena's age, with bright green scales still fresh in their coloring and large amber eyes that had spent most of his 3 weeks on Arithia for in a state of barely concealed anxiety. He had volunteered for the program through the new cultural exchange office in Velshari, which had taken a particular kind of courage, because coming to the world that Fisk-Aaron had attacked and expecting to be welcomed required faith in the possibility of better things that many of his own people did not yet possess. The other students had whispered about the pairing when the assignment was announced. Lena had been designated as his welcome partner, and the whispers were the kind that asked, without quite being willing to ask directly, how could she, of all the children in the school, be the right choice? How could she sit next to one of them? Lena had answered the question by pulling out a chair and sitting beside her own and looking at Corvin and saying, "Hi, I'm Lena. Do you want to sit down?" And that had been the end of the discussion. They shared the data pad now, their heads bent close over the screen, working through a research project on the formation of the Galactic Council. Corvin struggled occasionally with a human word, and Lena would sound it out for him, patient and unhurried. When Lena encountered Velshari's script in one of the source documents, Corvin would read it and translate it into standard with the careful precision of someone who understands that translation is not just a technical skill but an act of trust. They had been working together for 3 weeks. They had not discussed the attack. They had not discussed the war, or Fisk-Aaron, or the memorial outside the window, or the tremor in Elena's left hand. They had not discussed any of it, because they were 13, and 13-year-olds working on history project are primarily interested in getting the history project done, and because the weight of what their species represented to each other was something they were both carrying in ways they did not yet have a language to articulate. But they worked well together. Corvin was methodical and precise. Lena was quick and intuitive. They had already discovered that these qualities were complementary rather than competing, and that discovery, quiet, practical, arrived at through the specific alchemy of shared work, were perhaps more meaningful than any formal declaration of cooperation could have been. Mera Okafor watched them from a desk at the front of the room, and allowed herself a small, private smile. She had been the one to suggest Lena as Corvin's welcome partner, knowing exactly what it would require the girl, and trusting that Lena was equal to it, because she had watched Lena for 5 years, and she knew what the girl was made of. She had been right. Outside the classroom window, the 68 stone pillars stood in the afternoon light, casting long shadows across the garden. The flowers were blooming, the red, gold, and violet, and the particular morning blue that had shifted now to its midday green, and among them, Admiral Rennick knelt in the soil with dirt on his hands, working around the base of a new planting with a methodical care that he brought to everything he did here. He heard, through the open windows of the school, the sound of children working. Not laughter, not quite, but a particular ambient sound of a room full of young people engaged with something, questions asked and answered, the rustle of a data pad being repositioned, the quiet back and forth of people who are, without making a formal decision about it, beginning to trust each other. He stopped working. He closed his eyes. He had commanded fleets and planned campaigns and made decisions that had changed the shape of the known galaxy, and he was aware that history would assign him a weight for all of it. He was aware that Operation Nursery Rhyme would be studied and argued about for as long as any species kept records. None of that was the part that mattered to him now. What mattered was the sound coming through those windows. The sound of Lena Vasquez, who had survived something no child should ever have to survive, sitting beside a young Velshari whose people had been responsible for what she had survived, working on a history project on a warm Tuesday afternoon with the easy, unsentimental practicality of a person who has decided, without making a speech about it, that the world is still worth participating in. What mattered was a garden around him, tended by hand from 20 different families, growing in soil that had been made rich by grief and then by determination and then by the daily, unspectacular, irreplaceable human act of showing up and doing the work. What mattered was a memorial, the 68 names carved in stone, not as a monument to tragedy, but as a promise that these people had lived, and that their lives would be held in the memory of the living, and that the living would go on doing what Sofia Vasquez and Kenji Tanaka and Amara Johnson and 65 others had been in the middle of doing when the dropships tore the sky apart. They had been learning. They had been growing. They had been becoming. Rennick opened his eyes and looked at the pillar nearest to him. He had read this name so many times that he no longer needed to see the carving to know it, but he looked anyway, because looking was the point, because the act of directing attention, deliberate, specific, repeated, was how a person honored a weight they had accepted. Sofia Vasquez, age 10. He stayed with her name for a long moment. Then he turned back to the garden and continued his work. From inside the school, the sound of children continued, steady, unhurried, unremarkable, as ordinary and as essential as breathing. The sound of young human voices and one young Velshari voice, working through the same problem together, in a classroom on a small world at the far edge of human space, on a warm afternoon in a universe that contained, in approximately equal measure, both the capacity for the worst that any species could imagine and the capacity for this. This particular afternoon, this particular sound, the sound that Fiskaran had tried to silence, the sound that Rennick had gone to war to protect, the sound that Lena Vasquez, with a crayon and a sheet of paper and a damaged hand that still shook but still drew, had insisted on believing in even when she had every reason not to. It was still there. It would always be there. Not because the universe guaranteed it, but because the people who loved it would make sure of it. That was what it meant to be human. That was what it had always meant. And in the garden, among the flowers, Admiral Rennick pressed his hand into the warm soil of Arithia and listened, and was at peace. The drawing made by Lena Vasquez, two small figures holding hands beneath a yellow sun, one with brown hair and one with green scales, both smiling, remained in the permanent galactic record for as long as the record existed. It survived the political reorganization of the Galactic Council 50 years after the war, when the charter was rewritten to include species previously excluded. It survived the technological revolutions that made Nexus Point Station obsolete and eventually replaced it. It survived the slow dissolution of the Velshari Dominion as a political entity and the gradual emergence, over a century, of a Velshari civilization that bore so little resemblance to the one Fiskaran had served that historians began referring to the transition simply as the Arithia transformation. It survived all of these things because successive generations of archivists from a dozen species and then more made a point of ensuring that it did, not out of legal requirement, but out of something harder to codify and more durable, the collective recognition that some things matter, and that the job of keeping them present belongs to whoever is alive to do it. Lena Vasquez grew up. Her hand eventually stopped shaking. She became a diplomat. She worked, for 30 years, on human Velshari cultural exchange programs, not the famous kind that appear in history books, but the ground-level kind that actually change things, offices and difficult conversations and relationships built one patient exchange at a time. She was, by every measure her colleagues had, extraordinarily good at it. Corvin became a scientist. He spent his career studying the ecology of border world planets, including Arithia 4, which became one of the most comprehensively documented ecosystems in the known galaxy. Their collaboration lasted 4 decades. They disagreed frequently and productively, in the way of people who respect each other enough to be honest, and they were, by the end, the kind of friends that species differences make rarer and therefore more worth keeping. The memorial on Arithia 4 was never changed. The 68 pillars stood as they always had, and the garden grew outward around them, tended by successive generations of colonists and their children and their children's children. The Arithian flowers bloomed in their unnamed colors. The stone carried its names. And on warm afternoons, in the classroom where Mira Okafor had taught until she retired, and where her successors taught after her, the sound that Fiskaran had tried to silence filled the valley and drifted across the garden and reached the stone. and was not silenced. It was not silenced because it was the only answer that mattered, and the people of Arithia had decided to give it every day, without ceremony, without announcement, for as long as there were children to fill a classroom and a sky broad enough to let their laughter travel, which, as it turned out, was a very long time indeed.